Howdy gamers, let's talk about the runes for Ryze both mid and top lane. What Ryze is looking in runes is mostly utility, as you're going to get natural scaling in his kit and then through his itemization. His itemization is pretty set. There's really not much variation that works with it given the unique passive that he has and the unique scaling on his abilities where they scale with mana. It really sets you into an item build. And then the different runes that you can run usually don't offer him anything meaningful, as you're either getting early game damage from runes like Electrocute or Summon Airy or even Arcane Comment, which isn't so useful for Ryze, as he's really looking to maximize farming in the early game versus fighting champions because he's just scaling champion. And then scaling runes for him like Conquer or maybe Dark Harvest don't work as well either, as if you're lacking utility in the mid to late game, then you're really just not in any better spot from having the extra damage from these runes than you would be otherwise. So really, the only runes that would potentially give you value would be Phase Rush and I suppose Glacial Augment or Summoner Spellbook. Phase Rush is the most generally useful, as Ryze doesn't have any gap closers, and to get movement speed on him, you have to be hitting an enemy champion. And Phase Rush also gives you a lot of defensive utility in the laning phase. So if you choose Phase Rush, you end up in the sorcery tree. With Phase Rush, hitting an enemy champion with three separate attacks or abilities within 4 seconds grants you bonus movement speed and then 75% slow resist. That slow resist goes a long way on Ryze, as again, you have no gap closers. And even if the enemy has dove onto you, if you just simply retaliate with a QE, QW, or QE, or EQ, EW, then you can just root the enemy and run away, or even EWQ. You have the root on them, and then you get the extra movement speed to run away. And that's the best part of Phase Rush for Ryze, is that it helps him run away. Because if he's getting distance away from the enemy, then he's surviving the early game. And if you're surviving the early game, you're just in a position to win on Ryze. The offensive utility for Phase Rush is whenever you are in advantage on Ryze mid to late game, the first target that you're hitting is going to give you extra movement speed, so then you can choose to run them down. Or even the movement speed in a neutral situation where you're moving side to side is also going to help you whenever you're fighting champions in the mid to late game, as you're able to dodge their skill shots more, or just really gauge the situation depending on how it's going, and you effectively can choose whether you want to go further forward or further backwards depending on how the fight's going. So Phase Rush gives you early safety and then also gives you utility late game through the movement speed offered. And it's really hard to outweigh that on Ryze. For the secondary runes, you have good options in Nullifying Orb or Monoflow Ban. Nullifying Orb giving you a magic damage shield whenever you're low on health, but since Ryze is going to be basically negating the laning phase anyways, something like Nullifying Orb loses a lot of value. Champions that want to skirmish a lot get more value out of Nullifying Orb. Ryze is going to get his defense through his Seraphs or through his Rod of Ages, and then that's where you're going to be surviving champions anyways. If you're against a full AP comp, I think Nullifying Orb would start outweighing Monoflow Ban, but in general, Monoflow Ban is more useful. With Monoflow Ban, whenever you hit an enemy champion with an ability, you permanently increase your maximum mana by 25 up to 250. So that's a Sapphire Crystal for free, which is really good for Ryze. It's more valuable than other champions as his abilities scale off the mana offered. Whenever you've reached the 250 bonus mana, you restore 1% of your missing mana every 5 seconds. So it's effectively impossible to run out of mana with this passive in combination with Tier. So if you're against 3 AP champions or more, I think looking into running Nullifying Orb is worth it, especially if they're burst-oriented champions or execute-oriented champions, so champions like Syndra, Vigar, Karthus, etc. I think Nullifying Orb gives you a ton of value, but in most matchups, Monoflow Ban's going to be your default. For the third rune here, you have good options in Transcendence and I suppose Celerity, but the extra movement speed offered from Celerity is kind of whatever, and Transcendence just adds to your scaling anyways. Transcendence basically becomes a reward for winning or not losing the laning phase. If you're not losing the laning phase on Ryze, you're winning the laning phase. With Transcendence, you gain 10% cooldown reduction whenever you reach level 10, and each amount of cooldown reduction over the CDR cap is going to give you bonus ability power. So maybe in the mega late game you could start abusing that, but it's mostly just for the 10%. And then with that, with blue buff and then Maybe your third item, you could have some extra cooldown reduction, but it's most of the cooldown reduction that you're working with is just from Transcendence, and then maybe from the Shard here and the cooldown reduction per level Shard. The utility and celerity has to outweigh Transcendence, and the extra movement speed offered really doesn't do it. Maybe if you had a support that would give you movement speed, champions like Karma, you could make more of an argument for celerity, but as it stands, you already get enough movement speed from Phase Rush and your passive that celerity isn't going to be doing anything for those that they don't already do themselves. From my understanding, I could be wrong on that, but I think the scaling option in Transcendence just goes with how Ryze's kit works and gives you an amount of cooldown reduction for free that you otherwise just don't get through itemization at certain timings, and it's so important that you spike in the mid to late game as you effectively don't do anything in the early game. For the fourth rune, I think your best option is Gathering Storm. Pretty similar to Transcendence. You could run Scorch to have extra damage, but the extra damage on your abilities early game doesn't matter as much, and you're really just hitting the wave early game. So if you're trying to win the early game with Ryze, you're going to do it through just casting your abilities on the enemies anyways, and the extra damage you could build up through runes isn't really going to make a difference. So you're better off just getting as many scaling options as you can get to have that stronger 2-item spike. With Gathering Storm, it's going to give you ability power every 10 minutes. Really, most games you're going to be sitting on the 24 ability power offered at 20 minutes. That's completely fine to have that from runes, since you're building so much ability power, or so much mana with your items. It works pretty well. Ryze has a per 100 ability power thing too on his passive, so whenever you're completing Seraphs into Rod of Ages, it can help you meet those, so then you have more value out of the passive. For the secondary runes, I think your best option almost every single time is Taste of Blood and Ravenous Hunter. I think with Taste of Blood helps you offset a lot of damage in the laning phase. You heal whenever you damage an enemy champion, and then it's on a 20-second cooldown. The heal amount is okay, but it's not that crazy. It's mostly whenever you're damaging the enemy champion with like a retaliation Q, E, or auto attack, then that small amount of healing helps you offset a bit of their poke damage, and then through that you have a safer laning phase, and if you have a safer laning phase, you're scaling and then you're winning later. To have any of the other options in the domination tree is just super wasted. Something like Cheap Shot, you can only proc it in one way. To get ability power through like Zombie Ward, Ghost Poro, or Eyeball Collection is okay, as you have the per 100. If you're playing into a melee lane, I think it's completely fine to run Eyeball Collection, or even Ghost Poro. Ghost Poro, you would earn the ability power through placing wards, and then Ghost Poro would also extend the ward duration of the ward that you placed by 1 minute by placing the Ghost Poro. And with Eyeball Collection, you gain ability power through getting kills and assist. But again, if you're playing into a melee lane, you lose a lot of value from Taste of Blood, as they usually don't have abilities to poke you. Unless it's champions like Rumble, Mordekaiser, Ornn, where even though they're melee, they still have these short range abilities that can hit you. In those lanes, I think Taste of Blood would be perfectly fine. And into every ranged lane, I think Taste of Blood is going to be giving you really good value, again, because you're offsetting the damage that you're taking from the enemy's poke abilities while you're CSing or trying to push waves, etc. And through having that higher amounts of HP, makes things a lot less lethal for you, so that you can get away with pushing waves and getting recalls off that the enemy just can't deal with. Ravenous Hunter is one of the most important runes for Ryze, as you heal for a percentage of damage dealt by your abilities. This goes so well in combination with how this champion functions. Since he's so short range, it's so important to have healing from somewhere, and to get it from Rod of Ages, and then with Seraphs and with Ravenous, or not from Seraphs, but whenever you take some damage, you shield with Seraphs, and then you dump a full rotation of abilities, and then you're healing from Ravenous Hunter too. It makes it so strong. With Ravenous Hunter, you heal for a percentage of damage dealt by your abilities, and this percentage increases per unique takedown. So with Bounty Hunter stacks, if you get a killer assist on the top laner, that's 1 Bounty Hunter stack. The jungler, it's 1. And then for each unique takedown, you get plus 2.5% healing on your abilities. And it just goes so far on Ryze, as, again, since you're short range, you're way more likely to take damage. And whenever you can just retaliate damage and your abilities are effectively never on cooldown, he's one of the best users of this rune, maybe under Cassiopeia. So it's so important to run this rune on him. For the Shards, I think you're best off going with cooldown reduction, ability power, and then a resistance depending on your matchup. So obviously if you're playing into an AP matchup, you want the magic resist, and then if you're playing into an AD matchup, you obviously want the armor. I think the cooldown reduction shard is completely fine, as even though you're missing out on the ability power from the adaptive force shard, that ability power I don't think makes or breaks the damage that you have on a wave early game. And then through running the cooldown reduction shard, you're going to be sitting on about 7% CDR come level 12-ish. And with that, in combination with Transcendence, you can just cast your abilities more often. And to have them up more often in combination with blue buff, you get to about, 27% CDR for free? It's really, really insane versus having 9 more ability power. Which one, man? 9 more ability power. Think about it. The other secondary runes I feel like are really wasted because I think it's all about just outweighing Ravenous Hunter in like every single case because this rune is so important for Ryze. If you were to go for like something in the inspiration tree with like free boots Cosmic Insight, you don't need the cooldown reduction early because you're scaling anyways, and the free boots don't affect Ryze as well as other champions because usually you're trying to spike with Luden's Echo, Sorkpin boots, and then maybe an Oblivion Orb if you're running magical footwear. That's the real benefit of that for mid lane mages. Ryze functions differently. He's just scaling harder. Even if you went something like Biscuit Delivery, it's okay for Ryze. It gives you mana, yeah, but you're not outweighing the healing from Ravenous Hunter late game. Time Warp Tonic, you can make an argument for it, as Time Warp Tonic and Biscuits can help you survive early game. So at higher MMRs, maybe this would make sense, as again, you just get so much more immediate healing with Biscuit Delivery plus Time Warp Tonic, because Time Warp Tonic immediately would heal you from Corrupting Potion and the Biscuits. So especially against like lethal melee champions early game, you don't really have an option but to fight them. And if you have Biscuits and Time Warp Tonic, the fights become more in your favor in that sense, whether you're surviving them or beating the champions outright. So maybe at a higher MMR, into melee champions or like strong early game champions, you can make an argument for Time Warp Tonic and Biscuits. Something in Resolve would be entirely wasted too. Nothing's really going to save you with these runes as you're a ranged champion. Melee champions make better use of them, and there's just really nothing for them there. With Precision Secondary, you can get access to like more damage effectively with running Presence of Mind and then like either Coup de Grace or Last Stand. But again, I don't think you really need it. You lose out on the laning tool and Taste of Blood. With Presence of Mind, takedowns restore 20% of your missing mana, and then you also permanently increase your maximum mana. So you're effectively getting damage from this rune, and then you're also getting the mana regen, but it's really hard for Ryze to run out of mana in a fight as you build 2 mana items. So he's not like other champions where you can skirt the lines of like building a mana item or not because of this rune. And then you could also run Legend Tenacity, but if you're already in this tree, I think you should go for a percentage damage increase in either Coup de Grace or Last Stand. But then again, both of these, you're going to be killing champions without the damage increase from Coup de Grace or Last Stand. So I think both of these are luxuries versus the offensive defensive utility in the percentage healing from Ravenous Hunter. Maybe I'm off on those, but I don't think I am. So that's the runes that I recommend for Ryze, as really all he's looking for is utility and the extra movement speed you get from Phase Rush, and all the scaling that you get in both Mana Flow Ban with giving you mana, Transcendence giving you cooldown reduction, Gathering Storm giving you ability power. Even the Shard is giving you scaling, percentage cooldown reduction based on your level, and then percentage healing based on the damage dealt by your abilities. So much scaling, and then laning tool and Phase Rush, Taste of Blood. All of that, if you're getting Ryze to 2 items, that's really the best that runes can offer him, and Phase Rush will help you survive, and then through surviving, or even going even or losing a little bit in the laning phase, you can still be ahead of the enemy through the scaling in your runes and through your itemization and just through the champion's kit. Something like Conquer I think is a bit misguided, as you could run like all of this and that's okay, but Ryze doesn't make as good of use of Conqueror as he's a ranged champion, so it takes him longer to stack it up. The ability power offered doesn't make as big of an impact as you would think because you have mana and AP scaling on your abilities. So yes, you can be dealing more damage with Conquer, but where it takes it longer to stack it up, you're going to have to cast like 2 rotations of your abilities. And then you're going to be empowering maybe the 3rd or 4th rotation. And by that time, like a fight's over, completely over. Yeah, you can get 15% of healing on all the damage that you deal, but then you're out of a laning tool and you're out of Monoflow Band, you're out of Transcendence, you're out of Gathering Storm, all in exchange for all of these tools that don't do a lot unless you're snowballing. And if you're snowballing, you've already won on Ryze with the Phase Rush page. So, and you have more tools to snowball with the Phase Rush pages. You can run them down with Phase Rush versus not being able to. So I don't think Conquer's a terrible keystone on Ryze. I just think it's way harder to get value out of. Something like Glacial Augment, I'm not really sure, but I don't think it's that explored, and I don't think it would be that bad. You would be more supportive with Glacial Augment, as you would have Glacial Augment, free boots, biscuits, and then probably approach velocity, because the value of Cosmic Insight's kind of low. So with Glacial Augment, you could build Tier into GLP, into Twin Shadows, into probably Leandries at that point. I suppose you could build Tier into GLP, into Rod of Ages, but by that time, it would be really odd. Maybe it wouldn't be that bad, you know? But just having the one slow would feel awkward. It would probably be completely fine, you know? Tier, GLP, so you have the GLP active, Rod of Ages, and then complete the Seraphs. It might be completely fine. But with Glacial, I think you add a lot more functionality, obviously, to your champion, but you add a lot more utility to not only your kit, but to your whole team, and you give up a little bit of personal power in the mid and early game through your build. But then through doing so, it's the exchange for the utility. So with the slow, if you're playing into melee champions, I think that Glacial Augment becomes super, super good, as whenever they dive onto you or your team, the slow becomes so brutal for them to deal with, as your slow is going to set you up for 2 rotations of your basic abilities. And then through doing so, if they're on you and your team, if you're positioned defensively, then you're just naturally winning. Not only can you apply this Glacial Slow with the active items to the enemies on you, but you can also apply it to the enemies past them if you have the 2 items, or if the freeze ray hits them. So it becomes really, really, really brutal for the enemy to deal with. And even though you're missing out on like health on the build early game, you could equate the slow to more effective HP against melee champions, because if they can't stay on you, then they can't continue to deal damage. And if they're on you and you're like 80 carry, then it's even worse for them. So where that build path is kind of accessible for Ryze, and what you would be missing out on would be Phase Rush, Monoflow Band, Transcendence, and Gathering Storm. I think the exchange could be worth it depending on the team comp that you're playing into, if it's mostly dive oriented, and if your team comp was like relatively defensive. So if you had like a mage support, a Ezreal, a Nephilios, a Varus, good defensive bot lane, and then like a tank jungler and a tank top, it would be almost impossible for the enemy to dive onto you successfully because of the slow retaliation. And then if you're winning, the slow can become this like neutral tool in which you can create fights or create better situations in objective fights that the enemy has to deal with. So I think Glacial Augment might be okay on Ryze. I haven't seen it ever, but it's just a thought that I've been having. I think if you run this, then you should still go Domination second with Ravenous Hunter and Taste of Blood. I suppose you could swap to Cheap Shot, but Ravenous Hunter I still think would be really, really important for Ryze. In this case, you'd be skirting with less HP, so it would probably become more important in that case. And then I don't think the Shards would change. And I'm not sure about Cosmic Insight, but I think Approach Velocity would probably give you more value. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on Ryze runes. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I answer literally all of them. If this video helped you, leaving a like on the video helps me. And if you're interested in watching me talk or play League of Legends, you can check out my Twitch. It's twitch.tv/SawyearNelson. Links in the description. I'm really wondering about Glacial Augment Ryze, man. I have not played this champion. But, like, if people are willing to run Conquer, why not Glacial, man? And then just swap up the build a little bit. I don't know, man. Especially if it was defensive. I don't know. I'll find out, I guess. Alrighty, bye-bye.